Hello, I'm Michael Lambert, a fellow in social inequalities in the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University. And today I'm going to be speaking about listening to problem families, love, poverty, welfare and the state in post-war England, which relates to research undertaken as part of my doctoral thesis undertaken a few years ago in the Department of History at Lancaster University and funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So let me begin at the beginning. In the recent past, 10 years ago, in December 2011, thinking about this idea of troubled families, and that came to the headlines that year because there were a major series of riots across cities in Britain during the summer, which led to a major policy initiative being announced in the winter. And David Cameron, then the Prime Minister of Britain, went on the television and announced that whatever you've called them, those are troubled families, we've known for years that a relatively small number of families are the source of a large proportion of the problems in society. Drug addiction, alcohol abuse, crime, a cultural disruption and irresponsibility that cascades through the generations. That, in effect, what Cameron was doing was announcing a major policy initiative of family intervention into the lives of these so-called problem families as a way of overcoming the social unrest that erupted on the streets of Britain during the summer of 2011. What he did was to appoint a director of the Troubled Families Programme, Louise Casey, now sitting in the House of Lords, Dame Louise Casey. And I should also note that both Dame Louise Casey and the former Prime Minister David Cameron are now embroiled in a major corruption scandal. So what Louise Casey did was she undertook this process of listening to troubled families. So once they'd been identified according to the scheme of the programme, she then spoke with them, or supposedly listened to them, to find out what the issue was and how her policy initiative as director of the Troubled Families Programme might turn it around. And so Louise Casey, in her report, says that listening to the families, these troubled families, there was a strong sense of them having problems and causing problems for years. The longevity of their relationship with services was also striking. In many cases, their problems began with their own parents and their parents' parents in cycles of childhood abuse, violence and care, which are then replayed in their own lives. And what Louise Casey suggests is that the riots on the streets that are taking place in Britain, where it's mainly young men particularly, but also some women, the reason they're on the streets is because of poor parenting, and this is something that repeats after generation after generation after generation, in effect constituting a sort of underclass. And she says that by creating this policy intervention of identifying these families and intervening in their life, teaching them parenting skills, you can then remove this cycle of transmission from generation to generation. And the way that she articulates this is, she says, writing a few years later, bearing in mind that at this time the programme hadn't become mired in the scandal that it would do in a couple of years' time, where it was before the Public Accounts Committee for enormous financial failure. Louise Casey says that the experience of the Troubled Families Programme suggests that families respond incredibly well to tough love. That is, rather than pandering to their supposed needs, there was a way of getting to grips with them and turning their lives around on their behalf. And there are a number of problems with this view, as you might expect, and the first of which is articulated by Pat Starkey, and she very much says that the voices it claimed to reproduce were as much those of the researchers as of the clients, that effectively Louise Casey isn't listening to these troubled families, she's taking their life experiences and putting a certain spin on them, which privileges her own policy intervention, that of the Troubled Families Programme, with this kind of intensive intervention. This is something echoed by John Welshman when he says that in many respects the numerous reports published about troubled families tell us little of value about the families themselves, that effectively they're not being listened to, and rather more about professional rivalries and connections. And you have to bear in mind that the Troubled Families Programme is being launched in 2011 in the context of enormous government austerity, that is reductions in spending in the welfare state, that the Troubled Families Programme is guaranteed money in that other services are not, and in effect that they are laying their claim to be able to do something by the fact that they have guaranteed sources of funding, and it relates to the kind of fabric of the welfare state more than it does the families themselves. And this is something that John McNichol takes a stage further, and he says that as a class, this is the troubled families, or more accurately as a classification, the group could only be defined in terms of contact with welfare agencies. So they're defined as a trouble or a problem purely because they come to the attention of the state. A member of the social problem group was only a problem insofar as he or she, more accurately, consumes public resources through welfare services. So in effect, what they're saying is that Louise Casey isn't listening to these families. She is creating stories on and about them on their behalf in order to advance a particular agenda. The thing that the most astute of you will have noticed so far is that those three references I've just given of Pat Starkey, John Welshman and John McNichol are all written before the Troubled Families programme was launched, and that's because they're not writing about it. They're writing about problem families. And this is where the title of the slide comes, that history repeats itself, as Karl Marx famously said, first as tragedy and then as farce, because they're all talking about problem families, which was a major policy anxiety in the classic era of the welfare state from the 1940s through to the 1970s, which is kind of exemplified by this image here. And it's built on exactly the same tropes, the idea that there is a core of families in society which were disproportionately responsible for ills, and that's by identifying them and teaching them parenting skills and intervening in their lives, you can improve their life chances and those of their children. Entirely the same kind of policy dynamic, completely replicated, but 50 years previously. And so the criticisms, the critique are similar because it's the same basis on which they're being made. And so this is the source of my research, that I've been trying to understand who or what these problem families were, how they were identified by the welfare state, the kinds of interventions that were led, and what caused this interest in problem families to emerge, kind of have its zenith and then decrease in the post-war period, why it went out of fashion. So the way that I've done this so far is that I have taken the case files of individual families identified as a problem, and I'll talk about that more in just a second, and then worked outwards into the architecture of the welfare state by first, through the case files that sort of presented in front of me, through the different organisations that are working with these families. And this is both the statutory sector, so those built by the government and local authorities, also the voluntary sector, and this encompasses a range of different professions, government organisations, which understand what the problem with the family is from a whole different series of forms of expertise and lenses of understanding. The level above this is at the kind of local level and the national level of how these kinds of frontline interactions are then used to create a policy architecture. You know, there's a whole range of local committees, meetings where families are discussed and sort of action taken about them on their behalf, decisions taken about what should be done or shouldn't be done, the kinds of funding made available, and this in turn feeds into national policy changes. And this relates to kind of the top level that I'm viewing here, that this ultimately affects how the welfare state is run, how expertise is developed, how training is done through social workers, health visitors, doctors, a range of professions at universities, how their views are articulated through professional associations, and ultimately how problem families are conceptualized in party political terms as well, and how this then feeds back into the whole policy process. So basically I use the case files of individual problem families to understand this dynamic. Ultimately, I've got about 2,500 case files that I went through for the course of my research, and the overwhelming main source that these came from were voluntary centres, so-called rehabilitation and recuperation centres, where problem family mothers and their young children were sent for short periods of time to receive intensive parenting training and interventions, and then were returned to where they lived in order to kind of implement them and monitored for a number of years afterwards. And so these records range from, you know, a scrap of paper, a side of A4, or barely a side of A4, you know, 200, 300 individual pieces of paper. And these are taken for a number of centres, which were all modelled on the Brentwood Recuperative Centre, the first of them, which was established in 1935, but was very much part of the problem family emergence in the 1940s. So there's Brentwood, run by the Community Council of Lancashire. There are two homes entitled Mayflower, run by the Salvation Army. There's Spofford Hall and West Bank, run by the Elizabeth Fry Memorial Trust. There's then Mary's Mothercraft Centre, which was begun by the wife of the Bishop of Elgin. There are a series of centres in Birmingham, which are founded by the Middlemore Immigration Homes Trust, which is looking to repurpose what it does after child migration was frowned upon or slowly reformed in the post-war period. This doesn't apply to all organisations, but it does for Middlemore, looking for a new purpose. And lastly, Frimhurst, which is still open today, and was started by two social workers in the post-war period who had worked with problem families. And basically, there's my main source of information about problem families from the case file, working outwards to understand the architecture of the welfare state. And so what did I conclude from examining all of these case files? and trying to reconstruct these broader policy dynamics. I said that the existence of problem families points towards the continuation of poverty despite welfare, and this is due to the conditionality of the state. And so this is the title for this slide is Rethinking Welfare in the State. That in effect what I was doing is challenging this idea of the classic welfare state from 1940 to 1970 in Britain, as this idea of social democracy, by pointing out that there's been an overwhelming focus on welfare in this kind of understanding rather than what the state does and the kind of conditionality that goes with it. And I suggest there's a longevity which stretches back, to the poor law, the issues like less eligibility, a deterrence, and the kind of frugality of the states in trying to maintain labour discipline is the overwhelming focus. And so the very reason that these poor working class families encountered in the state was poverty, and I can't emphasise that enough. That was the only common characteristic. And this wholly uneven balance of power between families, poor families wanting material goods, and the state legitimated the expertise of officials in determining what the problem was, so the very concept of a problem family, and what action needed to be taken. And so the problem family does not just represent a discursive construct of elite alarm. So this is something that's very much hopefully come across so far, is the idea of an underclass or group in society is something of elite imagination. What I was also saying is that these families are very much identified in time, place and space by a whole phalanx of different sort of social work and welfare organisations, but a very real and material product of the operational structure of the welfare state to condition access to benefits based on the performance of gendered norms, which can only be reconstructed through the records of everyday actions and decisions of officials. That the last kind of point is that there's discrepancy between what officials said they did in kind of polite, professionalised, sanitised language in sort of how interventions were done and developed, and what actually took place that was sort of seen through the case files, the kind of naked semi-naked exposure of how families were treated by the organisations of the welfare state, and this kind of tension in many respects that existed. And so what I did was, after completing my PhD, I wrote it up and deposited a physical copy in the library and an electronic one, which is open access and available online. And at the time, I was kind of draw a line under that phase, sort of going through the research. But what happened next was entirely unexpected. That because if you were to look up any of these centres that I just talked about a moment ago, which were the main source of information for my PhD, if you were to be interested in any one of them, it is my PhD and my name that comes up first in any major search engine. And what happened next was that people who as children went to these centres, so their mothers were sent to them, that people as children who were sent to these centres began looking up me, looking up my name and getting in contact asking for information. And this complicated or made me in the last few years particularly rethink how I'd gone about approaching the PhD in the first instance, and the kinds of things that I was and wasn't able to say, and the whole purpose of the venture in the first place. And this ultimately kind of led me to rethink, rather than looking upwards into the welfare state and this kind of wider architecture, this kind of classic policy dimension, to look downwards into the family itself and the place of the child and children within the family as the main subject of inquiry. And so if you'll remember the previous diagram, there was just a little circle at the bottom which had problem families surrounded by this whole panoply of welfare organisations. Once you start to look within the family, and once I began to listen to what people who were there as children were starting to talk to me about, the whole focus of interest shifted entirely. That rather than focusing on the problem and the state and its architecture, it very much focused on the family and the kinds of dynamics and interactions which were ultimately, conditioned and shaped by these wider structures, but were very much interpersonal. They were subjective, and they were rooted in the kind of growing up under these very strained and difficult conditions, and how these personal dynamics and relationships changed over time. And I became very interested in the narratives and life course that people offered, that ultimately this kind of very compelling argument that Casey and others have put forward about this idea of intergenerational cycles of disadvantage is complete garbage once you start to speak with people and learn about their own life histories and reconstruct their own existence. That's not to say that there aren't complexities involved, but it's to point to this interpersonal situated dynamic, which is ultimately prioritising the family and the family history through the eyes of people wanting to learn more about growing up in their childhood and sort of growing as a child. And so what I did was to draw on some of the research here, and that ultimately it's a narrative and life course perspective when I started to speak with people and learning about their time notionally as a child in a problem family. So Jackie Gabb suggests that this relational perspective, the connections that we have with others and the ways that experiential threads are woven together across the life course, is a direct response to this conceptual interest in narratives and life stories. So rather than focusing outwards, it's about focusing the family as a centre of understanding and trying to trace them across time and space. And so there's an interesting article from, quite a while ago now, by Pam Cox, where she uses the autobiographies of girls, mainly, but a couple of boys as well, who were taken into care as children. And the autobiographies they've written about these experiences and the kind of later life that they draw upon, the impact that they have, is kind of framed around this initial encounter, almost, of being removed from their family. And she suggests that typically these writers rarely include memories of their earlier family life, of accounts of how they came to be removed from it. And that was something that really came reinforced to me by speaking with obviously they're now far older, but who were children of problem families, because most of them wanted to come for information about how and why they've come to these centres in the first place, what these centres even did, why they might be there, and why they might have remained in contact with them, because they remain very important centres around their lives and their own family stories that were often known about, but not in great detail. And here raises a tension almost in these narratives of how, in Pamela Cox's words, the home authorities, so the kind of organisations taking children into care, stories of unfit mothers, conflicted with the young women's own memories and ideations of former family life. And whilst that may have been true in a couple of instances that I've spoken with, that's not universal. And many kind of spoke about some of the family difficulties, the tensions, instances of cruelty, domestic violence, physical, sexual abuse within the family and within the household, which certainly doesn't chime with this. And there's also an issue here about how we articulate narrative, because it turned out that many of the people who contacted me didn't know that they'd even been in care at different moments in time, and how the kind of fixity of the narrative in Pam Cox's article about being taken into care and then life afterwards is very much suffused with this kind of interrupted bouts and periods of care, or periods of state intervention in kind of episodes and acute instances. So there's a way that I was rethinking my own narratives and how I constructed them, and equally the people I was speaking to as adults but talking about their own childhood were starting to rethink and relearn about their own family history in periods that they didn't know about, had very little memory of, or had incomplete or inaccurate information in many instances. And so the last point here is that, so John Welshman has used for previous writing, so John Welshman was my PhD supervisor, and he drew upon letters that mothers and some children who'd been to Brentwood during the period had written to the warden, but also other members of staff, kind of talking about their own experiences before, during and after, particularly after Brentwood, kind of writing about what happened since. And so he examines these letters and he argues that they, with their stories of poor health, bad housing and poverty, offer a novel perspective on post-war Britain from the view of the working class mother. And that's very, very true, and repeated through my own work on problem families, that very much focused on problem families as problem mother, as Pat Starkey suggests, and that's borne out by the case files and evidence. But ultimately, it says a lot about problem families, problem mothers, and those who are able to articulate and use that agency in one way or another. And I often drew upon this idea of reading against the grain, kind of classic subaltern literature, James C. Scott, to kind of understand these kind of forms of resistance, so to speak, and using these sources in a way that working class mothers have their views, even to an extent, able to be kind of reconstructed, understood, or felt through case files. But children were very much hidden in the background, and this was reaffirmed by in cases of applying to varying degrees of success to have access to case files and the kinds of information that people were presented with. It wasn't about them or ways of understanding their own history, it was that of their wider family, which is why I had the previous slide trying to show these broader dynamics. So what did I learn from this? So here I've got two images, which I'm very grateful that one of the people I spoke with very generously allowed me access to their own family history and their own sources of photographs of their mother. And so the two photographs I've got here, the first is of their mother and father as a courting couple, from the 1950s, and the second is of her mother before she met her father, out and about, dressed, to the nines in the style of the day, looking very fashionable, looking very glamorous. And I want to use these images to juxtapose with this kind of stereotyped kind of constant misery and poverty, which is the abiding image that's represented by the existing literature on problem families and sort of taken from the earlier slide. And it's to show that when you start to take away the problem and look at the family dimension of this, and it's a form of family history, there's a more complex picture that comes to light. And this, some common themes that I've drawn out here, just to show that there's more complex place of family love and loyalties. And this is kind of how families develop and change over time, beyond the kind of case file information that I've been using. How getting by in poverty remains an abiding experience and memory of children, and very evocative memories of being bullied, of stigmatization, and of knowing family financial difficulties and how it impacted every aspect of their life at the time was very, very common in kind of narratives that people were starting to construct. But also inequalities within the family, about relationships between brothers and sisters, and these kind of wider kinship network that I sort of alluded to just a moment ago. And this is both gendered, very heavily gendered in the kinds of dynamics that it produces, but it's also generational in how people were growing up at different moments in time, and that kind of maturing is very, very important in people's life histories, but it's very hard to reconstruct with case files. But there's also an ambivalence, as you might expect, between those that have very fond memories of these kinds of social workers, the state, and the sites of intervention, and very negative ones about either personally experiencing, real instances of violence, abuse, and harm from the state, and those that benefited from it. And there's a real kind of tension here. So what's the real point to rethinking the problem family through the lens of the family? Well, I take Liz Glowing and others' point that traditional historical approaches to understanding and valuing archival practices privilege state-driven modes of history making, formal institutionalized ways of thinking, and masculine and patriarchal forms of knowledge. And I hope you've got a sense that that's something of a self-critique that I have from my original PhD, that centres the problem over the family in this understanding, and that having very privileged access to family histories has rethought this. But equally, as Laura King sort of later says, that a lot of this family history goes with a sense of what their history is and are, that she says that I keep learning of new community initiatives around the family histories of particular groups or the long-standing interest of particular kinds of people. And whilst, I recognise and celebrate that particularly a lot of work around decolonising and taking ownership of history in a very public sense is to be sort of recognised and held up as a good way of doing things, that equally problem family is a label applied negatively and detrimentally from the state, and it's not a form of identity that anyone really identified with, that where it was mentioned it was always about other people rather than themselves. And so I think family history is a bit more nuanced in breaking apart these sorts of bigger forms of identity. And here I turn to Tanya Evans, who says that big pictures are constructed using lots of little people, and that's basically what I did for my PhD, that individuals need to be our focus, and they need to emerge from these kind of bigger social classes, genders and races from within specific social, economic and cultural contexts. And that kind of condition is very, very important. But it's important in this to have the family centered, and the individuals need to be prioritized. So when I talked a moment ago about learning a lot about gendered history, women's history, and working class history, that children were very much marginalized and again disadvantaged from this. And this kind of leads me to my concluding point, and drawing on Jenny Crane's argument that she says that the inability or ability of maltreated children to speak out cannot be separated from the broader social position of all children whose voices have not always been listened to in private or public. And something that's very forcefully brought this home is that the way that there are a number of inquiries into child sexual abuse have sort of rethought this kind of comforting corporate parent of the classic welfare state in this period, that I was already quite frankly aware of that from the problem family information that I had through the PhD, but the centering of the child within this, and kind of the way that I talk about 2,500 case files, but this encompasses probably about, I don't know, 10,000 children, that it's their lives in effect that I've been studying indirectly through the work that I've done, and equally they have a vested interest in recovering their own identity, their own history as part of this process, and that by centering the family and the dynamics of the family within this broader policy architecture, we can have a real sense about the dynamics of love, and the way that rather than that being a form of tough imposed top-down control from the state, as Louise Casey suggests, that I say there's a far more nuanced and complex dynamic which you can only get through this kind of subjective and felt form that is very much part of the family dynamics that are built and centered around the child and children.